The first letter showed up taped to my front door like some cheap horror movie cliché. Big, bold letters. Noise violation final warning. I stood there, turning it over in my hands, confused. I live alone, I work late nights, and my idea of a party is falling asleep to a documentary. I knew exactly who was behind it. Wendy Richardson, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, a woman who once tried fining a neighbor $500 for having a too bright porch light. Wendy had that permanent deep frown etched into her face, like she practiced scowling in the mirror every morning. I sighed, crumpled the letter, and stuffed it into my jacket pocket. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. If Wendy wanted a fight, I was ready. Later that night, I set up my old security cameras. I positioned one facing my front porch, another in my living room. If she was planning to pull something, I needed evidence. Sure enough, 2 days later during my lunch break, I found another notice taped to my door. Second noise violation, immediate hearing scheduled. I ripped it off and headed straight to the HOA clubhouse. The meeting room smelled like burnt coffee and bad decisions. Wendy sat at the head of the table, wearing a pastel pink blazer that screamed fake authority. Her minions, 3 other HOA board members who acted more like her personal cheer squad, sat around her. "Kyle Vance," Wendy said, adjusting her glasses with a smug little flick. "We've received multiple complaints about excessive noise coming from your property. Loud music, shouting, and disturbances at inappropriate hours." I raised an eyebrow. "Funny, I work nights, I'm barely home." She gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Regardless, the evidence is overwhelming. We'll be issuing a fine of $1,000. I crossed my arms. "Where's the evidence?" Wendy tapped a folder. "Signed complaints from 3 different neighbors." I leaned in. "Which neighbors?" She shuffled the papers, clearly stalling. "Confidential." I laughed out loud. "You're kidding me. You can't just make up complaints and fine people." Wendy's face turned a shade redder. "The board has full authority to enforce community standards." I pulled out my phone. "Good thing I recorded my house the past few nights. Want to hear all the ruckus?" The room shifted uncomfortably. Wendy hesitated, then nodded, her fake confidence wavering. I hit play. 30 minutes of pure, blissful silence. You could hear a pin drop. No music, no shouting, not even a dog barking. When the recording ended, I looked around. "Any questions?" Wendy opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her little minions looked at each other, unsure what to do. I wasn't about to let her wriggle out of it, not this time. I tucked my phone back into my jacket, letting the heavy silence stretch across the room. Wendy's fingers tightened around the edge of the folder like she was trying to crush it into dust. "I think," said one of the board members, a wiry man with thinning hair and a nervous glance, "we should review this matter further before making a final decision." Wendy's eyes flicked to him, sharp and dangerous. She didn't like being challenged, even by her own people. I wasn't about to let them slink away and regroup behind closed doors. "No," I said, voice steady. "You accused me in front of the board. I want this settled here." Wendy licked her lips, the confidence draining out of her. "We have multiple witness statements. That's enough under Article 7, Section 2. Article 7, Section 2 requires corroborating evidence," I said, pulling out a folded printout from my back pocket. "Not just complaints." "Actual proof." She blinked, caught off guard. "Where did you get that?" "Public records. You're supposed to provide homeowners access to the HOA bylaws within 3 business days of request. You didn't, so I went to the county clerk's office." The room shifted again, unease rolling through the board members like a slow wave. Wendy's mouth pressed into a thin line. "And funny thing," I continued, laying another sheet on the table, "I found something else. Your HOA insurance policy doesn't cover legal fees for board members acting outside their authority." The man with thinning hair paled visibly. Wendy's jaw tensed. "If you find me without evidence," I said, tapping the papers, "I can sue each of you personally for damages." The smallest board member, a woman with a pixie haircut and a twitchy knee bouncing under the table, finally found her voice. "Maybe we should dismiss the complaint." Wendy shot her a look that could have melted steel, but the others were already nodding. The tide had turned. "Fine," Wendy snapped. "Complaint dismissed." I stood up slowly, gathering my papers. "Appreciate it." I turned to leave, but halfway to the door, I paused and faced them again. "You know," I said, voice casual, "false accusations are a violation of state law, especially when it involves financial penalties." Wendy's face lost what little color it had left. I walked out into the crisp evening air, but I wasn't done. Not even close. Back home, I started digging. If Wendy was willing to fake noise complaints, what else had she been hiding? Over the next week, I spent every night combing through public records, old meeting minutes, and property tax filings. It didn't take long to find the rot. Turns out, the HOA had been issuing fines left and right for the past 2 years, over $20,000 collected from homeowners. Most of it for vague violations no one could ever verify. Even worse, a chunk of that money had been mysteriously earmarked for administrative expenses, with no receipts attached. I compiled everything into a fat dossier and called a few of my neighbors. Most were wary at first. Nobody wanted to poke the bear, but when I showed them the documents, the anger built fast. We organized a meeting at my house. A dozen people crammed into my living room, sipping bad coffee and flipping through pages of evidence. "She fined me $400 for unapproved landscaping," said Mrs. DeSoto, a retired teacher who lived 2 houses down. "All I did was plant tomatoes." "I got hit with $300 for lawn maintenance violations when I was out of town for a funeral," added Mr. Patel, shaking his head. By the end of the night, we had a plan. First, we filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Consumer Affairs, citing fraudulent fines and misuse of HOA funds. Then we pooled resources to hire a lawyer specializing in HOA abuse cases. And for good measure, we contacted a local news station. They loved the story: corrupt HOA president scamming hardworking homeowners. It was ratings gold. The fallout started within days. The Consumer Affairs investigator showed up unannounced at the HOA office, clipboard in hand. Wendy tried to bluff her way through it, but investigators are trained for that. They requested financial records, meeting minutes, and copies of all issued fines. When Wendy stalled, they came back with a warrant. The news van rolled in right behind them. I stood at my front window, sipping coffee as a reporter cornered Wendy on the sidewalk, shoving a microphone in her face. "Miss Richardson, is it true the HOA has been illegally issuing fines without evidence?" Wendy stammered, then bolted for her car, cameras following her every step. Within 72 hours, the board called an emergency meeting. This time, it wasn't in their cozy clubhouse. It was held at the local community center, under the watchful eye of 2 uniformed police officers. I sat in the front row, arms crossed, watching Wendy squirm at the head table. The lead investigator stepped up to the podium. "After reviewing records, we have found evidence of financial misconduct, falsification of violation notices, and failure to maintain proper documentation as required by law." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "As a result," he continued, "the current HOA board is hereby suspended, pending a full audit and potential criminal charges." The officers moved forward. Wendy's face twisted in disbelief as they escorted her out, hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. The neighbors erupted into applause as the door slammed shut behind her. But we weren't done yet. The state appointed a temporary management company to oversee the HOA while the investigation continued. Part of their job was to facilitate a new election, one where homeowners could finally vote for honest leadership. I ran for the board, along with Mrs. DeSoto and Mr. Patel. We didn't campaign with cheap flyers or empty promises. We showed up at every doorstep with one message: transparency, accountability, and community on election night. The results weren't even close. As the new president, my first act was to implement an open records policy. Every homeowner would have full access to budgets, meeting minutes, and board decisions. No more secret fines. No more confidential complaints. We even set up a monthly town hall meeting where anyone could voice concerns, no fear of retaliation. The neighborhood transformed almost overnight. Yards looked better, people waved more, and for the first time in years, the community actually felt like a community. One afternoon, as I was helping Mrs. DeSoto plant a new flower bed in front of the clubhouse, she chuckled. "Funny how quiet it's been lately," she said, patting the soil. I grinned. "Yeah, real peaceful. No fake complaints, no trumped-up fines. Just the sound of kids laughing, birds chirping, and neighbors living their lives without fear. Exactly the way it should be. The weeks following the election were a whirlwind of rebuilding." With Wendy and the old board suspended and under investigation, the neighborhood had a cautious optimism hanging in the air. Still, something gnawed at me. After everything we uncovered, it felt like there had to be more hiding beneath the surface. One evening, after a long day of sorting through old HOA documents, I found it. Buried among years of receipts and invoices was a series of payments made out to a shell company, Greenview Landscaping LLC. On paper, it looked like the HOA had been paying them monthly for maintenance. But there was no record of any actual work being done. No contracts, no service reports, just large payments, thousands of dollars at a time, signed off by Wendy herself. I stared at the papers, heart pounding. Greenview Landscaping's registered address was a P.O. box in a neighboring town. The listed owner, a name I recognized immediately, Alan Richardson, Wendy's brother. The room felt suddenly colder. This wasn't just petty fines and bullying. This was outright fraud. I called an emergency meeting with Mrs. DeSoto and Mr. Patel. As soon as they saw the papers, their faces darkened. "We have to take this to the authorities," Mr. Patel said firmly, tapping the documents. Mrs. DeSoto nodded. "If we sit on this, we're no better than they were." The next morning, we walked into the district attorney's office with a full binder of evidence. The DA assigned an investigator on the spot, someone who specialized in white-collar crimes. Within days, subpoenas were issued for bank accounts, HOA financials, and communication records. The investigation moved quickly. It seemed Wendy's arrogance had made her sloppy. Email records revealed she had authorized payments without board approval, falsified meeting minutes to show phantom votes, and even altered financial statements submitted to the IRS. One rainy Thursday, the police raided Wendy's house. I stood on my porch and watched as two unmarked cars pulled into her driveway. Officers in plain clothes approached the door. Moments later, Wendy was led out in handcuffs, her pastel sweater clinging to her in the drizzle. Her brother Alan was picked up the same afternoon at his office. The charges were serious: felony embezzlement, wire fraud, falsifying business records, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Combined, they were looking at decades behind bars if convicted. The news exploded across local media. Reporters circled the neighborhood like vultures. Neighbors whispered in clusters at the park and on street corners, the tension finally breaking into something closer to relief. At the next community meeting, held in the newly renovated clubhouse, the turnout was standing room only. I stood at the front, holding a stack of fresh documents. "This," I said, holding up the papers, "is everything the auditors found. Over $100,000 stolen from us over the last 3 years. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "The good news," I continued, "is with the evidence we provided, the court has frozen Wendy's assets. There's a strong chance we'll recover a significant portion of the stolen funds." An older man in the back raised his hand. "How did it go on so long without anyone noticing?" I nodded. "Fear and confusion. They counted on residents not knowing their rights, and they manipulated the rules to hide their tracks. That's why transparency is the only solution." Applause broke out, filling the room with a kind of cathartic energy. After the meeting, I lingered to help clean up. As I folded chairs, a woman approached, a new face I didn't recognize. She wore scrubs, her hair pulled back tight after a long shift. "I'm Emily," she said, offering a tired but genuine smile. I work at the hospital down the highway. I just moved in a few months ago. Welcome to the neighborhood, I said, shaking her hand. I wanted to thank you, she said. I didn't know about all the craziness when I bought my house. If you hadn't stood up to them, I probably would have ended up trapped like everyone else. I shrugged. Wasn't just me. It was everyone waking up and pushing back. She looked thoughtful for a moment. If you ever need help organizing anything, I'm good at logistics. Comes with the job, I grinned. We could definitely use someone like you. As the weeks wore on, more neighbors stepped up. Volunteers helped repaint the clubhouse. A group of teenagers organized a cleanup day at the neighborhood park. Someone even started a monthly newsletter to keep everyone informed. The transformation wasn't just physical. People talked more, trusted each other a little more. It felt like we'd reclaimed something that had been stolen from us long before the money ever was. One afternoon, I got a call from the DA's office. Wendy and her brother have agreed to a plea deal, the assistant DA said. They'll be pleading guilty to multiple counts, paying restitution, and serving prison time. How much restitution? I asked. $75,000 plus court-ordered community service, full restitution if they violate probation. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to fund repairs, lower HOA dues, and even start a reserve fund for emergencies. I shared the news at the next community cookout, and the cheers nearly shook the park pavilion as the sun set and kids chased each other through the grass misses. DeSoto sat beside me at one of the picnic tables, sipping lemonade. You know, she said thoughtfully, I think we owe a lot to that first fake complaint. I chuckled. If Wendy hadn't tried to frame me for noise violations, none of this would have come to light. Mrs. DeSoto laughed, a warm, genuine sound. Funny how the worst people sometimes set their own traps. I leaned back, watching the sky turn shades of gold and pink. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt alive not with fear, but with hope. And all it took was a little courage, a lot of persistence, and a recording of pure, beautiful silence. A few weeks after the cookout, things settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind of quiet our neighborhood hadn't known in years. Still, there was a lingering tension just beneath the surface. The old board was gone, but the damage they had done left scars that would take time to heal. One afternoon, as I was filing away the last of the old HOA documents, I found something that made my stomach twist. It was a letter, dated from 2 years ago, addressed to a contractor about a supposed community improvement project. The project never happened, yet the contractor's signature was forged at the bottom, approving a payment of $20,000. The signature wasn't even a good forgery. It looked like it had been traced by a shaky hand. I immediately called our attorney, Mr. Langston, who had been helping us navigate the fallout from Wendy's mess. His reaction was immediate and grim. This isn't just embezzlement, he said. This is felony forgery. It opens up a whole new investigation. Within 48 hours, the police were back in the neighborhood. This time, they weren't just collecting financial records, they were interviewing former board members, checking personal bank accounts, and cross-referencing the HOA's past projects. At a special meeting called by the interim management company, Detective Harris from the Financial Crimes Division addressed the community directly. We have sufficient evidence to believe that forged documents were used to authorize significant disbursements from HOA funds, he said. We are expanding the investigation to include potential money laundering activities. The room fell deathly silent. No one had even considered that the fraud could run that deep. Detective Harris continued, if you were pressured to sign anything, approve payments under duress, or received unexplained fines, please come forward. Mrs. Kowalski, who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built, stood up slowly. Her voice trembled. I was on the board for a few months. About 2 years ago, Wendy. She told me to sign blank checks because it was routine. I didn't know. I thought it was just standard procedure. Harris nodded, scribbling notes. Thank you, ma'am. That's very helpful. After the meeting, neighbors gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed, nervous tones. It was one thing to know Wendy was crooked. It was another to realize she had manipulated people into being unwilling participants in her crimes. By the following week, subpoenas had been issued for Wendy's former board allies. 2 were arrested for conspiracy to commit fraud. Another one, a man named Greg who had always been a little too eager to enforce petty rules, fled the state. A warrant was issued for his arrest. The local paper ran a front-page story titled, "Neighborhood Nightmare. HOA Fraud Unravels Massive Scheme." Reporters dug up even more dirt, including a second shell company tied to Wendy's cousin that had received consulting fees for non-existent projects. It felt surreal, walking down the same streets where just months ago Wendy had ruled with an iron fist. Now her house sat empty, the front lawn overgrown, a foreclosure notice taped to the door. One afternoon, Emily, the nurse who had recently moved in, caught me outside while I was fixing the community bulletin board. "You realize," she said, adjusting her backpack, "you basically led a small revolution, right?" I laughed, tightening a screw on the board. "I just wanted some peace and quiet. Didn't expect a criminal empire buried under the HOA," she smiled faintly. "Well, you got a lot more than peace. You gave people their neighborhood back." As she walked away, I realized something. This fight hadn't just been about fines or fake complaints. It had been about taking back ownership of our own lives from people who thought they could bully and steal without consequence. Later that month, the DA's office held a public press conference. Wendy, her brother Greg, and 2 other former board members were officially charged with multiple felonies, including grand larceny, wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and money laundering. The judge denied bail for all but one, citing flight risks and the amount of money involved. The trial was set for early spring. In the meantime, the state appointed an independent auditor to oversee the HOA's finances. Every resident received a detailed report showing exactly where every dollar was going. For the first time in years, people smiled at board meetings. Questions were welcomed, not punished. Decisions were made openly with full transparency. When the day of the trial finally arrived, a group of us carpooled to the courthouse. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about closure. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as the prosecutor laid out the case. Dozens of exhibits were presented: forged signatures, fake invoices, bank transfers to personal accounts. The defense tried to argue that Wendy had been misled by others, but the evidence was overwhelming. When Wendy took the stand, her composure cracked. Under cross-examination, she admitted to authorizing payments she knew were fraudulent, forging signatures, and directing funds to her brother's company. The jury took less than a day to deliberate, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Wendy to 18 years in prison, with no chance of early parole. Her brother received 15 years. Greg, who had been captured in another state, got 10 years. The other 2 board members received lesser sentences but were still facing years behind bars. After the verdict, we gathered outside the courthouse. The air was crisp, the sky a clear, piercing blue. Mrs. DeSoto, bundled in a thick coat, looked at me with a satisfied nod. "Justice has a long memory," she said. Mr. Patel clapped me on the back. "You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for all of us." I didn't have much to say. The weight of the past year pressed against me, but it was a good weight, the kind that came from doing the right thing, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. Back in the neighborhood, we held a celebration at the park. Kids ran laughing between picnic tables. Someone set up a grill. A local band played classic rock covers. At sunset, Emily called everyone's attention to the stage we had cobbled together from plywood and borrowed speakers. "I think we owe Kyle a huge thank you," she said, raising a glass. "For standing up when it would have been easier to back down. For reminding us that this is our home, not theirs." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous or wild. It was steady, heartfelt, and filled with gratitude. I stood there, feeling a strange mix of pride and relief. Not because I had taken down a corrupt HOA president, but because somehow we had taken back our community. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, people lingered, laughing and talking well into the night. No fear, no intimidation, just a neighborhood finally free. The security cameras that once recorded silence now captured something better: the sounds of a community reborn.